What's going on, everybody? Gunner here, and welcome to the fly casting blog. Basically, I just wanted kind of an informal way to talk about casting stuff when I'm out here practicing, which I do probably once or twice or 3 days a week. I just cast for 30 or 40 minutes because I'm always trying to get better. And this weekend I had a really cool opportunity to film some musky fly fishing with Brad Bohen, and we were there with Robert Thompson, and they're working on a new project, and we missed some good fish. Hopefully it'll turn into some good laughs. But now a few things came out of that trip, and I'm going to demonstrate. This is a 7-foot 4-weight fiberglass rod from Eagle Claw. I picked it up at Fleet Farm for like 30 bucks, but it's kind of gaudy yellow and it's super soft. Really fun rod to practice cast with, but hopefully you'll be able to see that rod track in the air. You'll be able to see the tip deform. You'll be able to see me stop the rod. A lot of things I kind of want to just talk about. It's also a fun tool to practice with, but that's what we're using today. So I want to talk about like 3 things to practice that I'm practicing that really came out of that trip. And a lot of it was just self-revelation. When you're casting musky flies for like 14 hours, you tend to realize these things. But the first is the Belgium Cast. The second thing we'll go over is bending the rod and stopping it, mostly the stopping part. And the third is just using wrist in your cast. Yes, using wrist in your cast. So as we go over these, a few things to consider. The Belgium Cast, absolutely critical to know how to do and perform if you're fishing weighted flies. It's also what I'm going to demonstrate is how to avoid the kiss of death. And what the kiss of death is, you're carrying kind of a lot of line, like maybe 35, 40 feet. You get way back here and your fly kicks over and it drops and it hits the water right as you begin that forward cast. And it's like, you know, like your wrist like snaps in half because you have a 12-inch fly that just kissed the water, and you freaking buckle that rod and break your wrist in half. So it's a really cool way to avoid that, which is why I want to talk about it. When we go over bending the rod and stopping, the key to that is you have to stop the rod. You put all this bend in it. You have to stop the stupid rod to get it to unload. And what people don't do is they'll keep going and they'll slow down, and the rod will start to unload, but it won't unload all of its energy. You'll get like 70% of it or 60% of it or 50% of it, and you'll get this big stupid open loop that really doesn't transfer any energy, and it doesn't do you any good. And the trick to stopping the rod is the third point, which is using your wrist. And everybody says not to use your wrist because what people do is they tend to go back and then they break the wrist, and you get this big open loop that goes right into the ground, which isn't very helpful. But what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to do a flick stop and actually stop that rod on a dime, getting the rod to move as fast as humanly possible right before it stops, which means you have to flick your wrist. You have to use your wrist to get the proper pop and timing to really send a loop forward. And that becomes really critical as you step up in fly size, being able to throw a tight loop so that you can carry a 12 or 14-inch fly to target when you're fishing big stuff, or a 7-inch, you know, you scale that down for the size fly and the weight of rod that you're throwing. So you have to be able to use your wrist. You have to be able to flick everything to a stop so that you're properly accelerating, and then stop that thing on a dime so you transfer all of the energy. And if you incorporate that with a Belgium Cast for your back cast, then your big flies aren't touching on your back cast and your weighted flies aren't hitting your rod tip. So it's really all one big long topic, but we're going to break it up into sections. So let's dive into the Belgium Cast. I'll show you everything you need to know on how to perform it properly for fishing heavy flies and for fishing big wind-resistant flies that you don't want to come down and get the kiss of death on your back cast. So let's do it. All right, guys, so what I want to go over is the Belgium Cast first. The Belgium Cast is a non-linear back cast. And when you think of fly casting, basically it's all straight lines. What you're literally shooting for is just boom, boom. You want no linear left to right deviation, and you basically want no vertical deviation of that rod tip, which means you have to progressively accelerate into that rod. So you get this perfect straight line path of the rod tip. That's maximum efficiency, maximum air resistance, right? Gets you the tightest loop. But when you're fishing a really big fly, you don't want that loop to smash into your rod tip. Now, when you're fishing a really wind-resistant fly, a really big fly, I talked about the kiss of death. And basically, if you throw that vertical loop, that loop's going to unturn and kind of kick down. If you have a vertical loop, it's going to kick down. And in that pause, when everything's behind you, a lot of times it'll just land on the water. The fly will just, that timing, especially if you're carrying 35, 40, 45 feet of line, you're carrying longer line, you have a big fly on there, it'll slow down, kick, hit the water as you're making that forward cast, and the kiss of death sucks. It really sucks, which is why I want to talk about the Belgium. So what you're going to do, you're basically going to start with a sidearm. You know, you should be able to sidearm cast, keeping that fly line like 2 feet off the ground, 3 feet off the ground. You're basically going to do a sidearm. As soon as you hit your hip, you're going to make a non-linear back cast with a big circle arc to it and end really high. And what's really cool is that loop, your fly line does what your rod tip does. So that fly line's going to start low, it's going to kind of curl up and end really high, and it's going to keep a wind-resistant fly off the water for the kiss of death, and it's going to keep weighted flies the heck away from your rod tip. So this, and you can just do it with your arm, and you can do it with your body. Instead of trying to make this linear cast, you're making a non-linear cast ending really high with your stroke. Did you see that? Did you see that? Look how cool this is. Watch how non-linear that yellow rod tip is, and watch how the loop ends really high. Right? It's absolutely sick. So that's the Belgium cast, something well worth practicing. And it is really kind of economical to drift into, meaning when you stop the rod, you kind of stop it and then drift up into your top. Elongate your casting stroke, carry a little bit more line, more progressive load. It's a sick thing to do. That's all you need to know. There's a lot of videos on it. Look at those videos, check it out, familiarize yourself, practice it. I'm not going to beat it to death here because we got 2 other things to cover. So let's dive into the other topics. So what we're going to talk about, stopping the rod. When I was fishing with Brad, this is something I actually kind of realized I wasn't doing on my forehand stroke. And what was pretty fascinating is I actually do a really good job of this with my big rods. And this is kind of why it's relative, but it's my big rods when I cast backhand. Because when I cast backhand, I'm much better at popping with my wrist because it's a pull stroke. And so you can kind of let it flex and boom, stop it on a dime. But it's really hard to flick stop on that presentation cast, on your forehand cast, with a really heavy rod, like a 10 weight, right? And so I wasn't stopping the rod very well because I wasn't flick stopping the rod. So kind of the second and third topic are more or less the same here, but I was basically coming in and I couldn't keep the acceleration going, and I would just let it kind of like fade out. And the problem with that is, and when I mentioned it at the beginning, you're trying to load the snot out of this thing progressively, accelerating through the stroke, and then you stop it. And when you stop it, you release 100% as efficiently as you can, but ideally 100% of that energy goes into the fly line, and you get the greatest bang for your buck, right? You get efficiency. But when you don't stop that rod, if you just start kind of de-accelerating, I almost can't really do it with the soft one because I'm trying to condition myself. But you're literally slowing down, and as you slow, the moment you slow down, the moment you stop accelerating, the rod's going to start unloading, but you're no longer going to transfer all that energy. And what's really cool about this glass rod is if I carry a lot of line and I accelerate the crap out of it and I go for extreme distance and I stop it on a dime, you'll see the rod go whoosh, 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 whoosh. It'll like wave around in the air because it's soft and flimsy. So check this out. It's cool. I'll do it again. I got a little bit of a cross breeze, but we'll be all right. that had a little bit of extra on it. I might be able to cast a full fly line with this 7-foot 4-weight, $30 rod. It'd be pretty comical. Look at that, man. That's sick. It's like an 80-foot cast with this thing. $30 bucks. That's ridiculous. I got it so that my kid when he wants to learn how to fly cast, you know, he's not waving around a $300 rod, but he can beat the snot out of this thing and I won't care. But that's sick. So hopefully that's in frame, but boom, you have to stop it on a dime and you'll see that rod, boom, it just wiggles, man. Super important that you do that. And the best way to learn how to do this is to use your wrist. And everybody says not to use your wrist in fly casting because what beginners do is they break their wrist. You don't want to break your wrist. And what I mean is this. They'll do, instead of coming up here and flicking, just pop, pop, pop. Instead of flicking the wrist, they'll break their wrist. And you see I'm casting, I'm not casting forward and backwards, I'm casting in a circle. They'll cast in a circle and you're throwing the energy down and around and down. You should be throwing the energy forward and backwards, but you can still flick, flick. You can still integrate that wrist pop, and you almost have to if you want to be able to throw a fly line with a tight loop accurately. You have to pop your wrist. And the most important thing, and I mentioned it earlier and I sound like a broken record, but the goal is to accelerate through the stroke. So you have to start slow and get faster and get faster and get faster. And the way you do that is you add up your body parts. You got your big, you got your core, you got your butt, you got your hip drive coming in, transitioning into your arm, transitioning into your wrist. And the smaller, when you add all those things, boom, right? The wrist is how you accelerate. The wrist is how you finish as fast as possible, but also how you stop it. And it's very kind of intuitive on the forward stroke because you almost can't break your wrist on the forward stroke. It stops, boom, and it locks right in place. But it's really easy to break it on the backstroke. So you got to train yourself to use your wrist, but to stop it on the backstroke and then to power through and get a nice pop right at the end. You should be pop, boom, right? It should be Tom Bell always says backstroke or backslash, backslash, forward slash. You save that wrist pop for the very end, and that's your proper timing, and it's how you get that acceleration. But you have to be able to flick stop the back cast and the forward cast. And that's that backslash, backslash, boom, forward slash, and that forward slash is the wrist. It's the wrist pop. The backslash is your hips, the backslash is your arm, boom, forward slash is your wrist. So use your wrist, stop it on a dime, integrate a nonlinear back cast ending high so your big flies don't do the kiss of death, your weighted flies don't hit your rod tip. You can obviously throw tight loops in your back cast as well if you need to, but it's all useful. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. It's kind of maybe it was a little bit more formal than I intended, but regardless, thanks for watching the first fly casting blog of me running my mouth for a while. I hope it helps you out. I hope it gives you something to practice. If you got $30 the next time you're at Fleet Farm, it's a cool practice tool, especially if you film yourself, which I'd recommend. That way you can see if you're breaking your wrist, you can see if you're stopping the rod, you can see if you have a non-linear back cast ending with a nice high loop. Like, film yourself, because it's a cool tool because you can see it and it deforms. It's really soft, so you can see that non-linear path. You can see if you stop and it waves around. You can see everything, hopefully. I haven't actually watched the footage yet, but for 30 bucks, it's a cool casting tool to play with.